An overconfident rookie officer thought he could outsmart a seasoned judge. He couldn't have been more wrong. The courtroom was alive with a quiet buzz of anticipation, the kind that seemed to hum through the air just before something dramatic unfolded. It was a typical Monday morning in the courthouse of Wilmington, Delaware, a place where justice moved at its own deliberate pace. Inside, rows of spectators filled the benches, their faces a mix of boredom and curiosity as they waited for the next case. Seated at the front, behind the polished wood of her bench, was Judge Regina Fowler. She wasn't the type to demand attention. Her presence did that for her. With decades of legal experience under her belt, her reputation was built on fairness, resilience, and a sharp intellect that could pierce through the most convoluted arguments. People respected her, not because she was loud, but because she didn't need to be. Every word she spoke carried weight. Today's docket seemed ordinary enough. An arraignment for a minor public disturbance, a couple of property disputes, and one case involving an off-duty officer. Nothing that would make headlines. But as the session began, the courtroom doors swung open with a sharp creak, and in walked Officer Dylan Kane. Fresh out of the academy, his uniform was pressed to perfection, and his steps carried an arrogance that was impossible to ignore. He paused to survey the room, his eyes briefly meeting the judge's. Judge Fowler acknowledged him with a simple nod, her expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time she'd seen a young officer walk in with a chip on his shoulder, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was something about Kane's demeanor that set her on edge. His stride was too confident, his gaze too challenging for someone who had barely begun his career. As the morning's cases proceeded, the tension in the room thickened. Kane's name was eventually called, and he strode forward, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. The clerk read the details of the case. Kane was accused of using excessive force during a routine arrest. While the defendant's injuries were minor, the incident had raised enough questions to bring it before Judge Fowler. As she glanced over the case file, she raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Officer Kane," she began, her tone firm but measured. "This is a courtroom, not your training grounds. I trust you'll show the proper respect for these proceedings." Kane's smirk grew, barely masked by a facade of politeness. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." But there was a sharpness in his tone, a subtle jab that didn't go unnoticed by the judge or anyone else in the room. But the real fireworks hadn't even begun yet. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as Officer Kane stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped casually in front of him. His attorney, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, whispered something in his ear, but Kane barely acknowledged him. His gaze remained fixed on Judge Fowler, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Officer Kane," the judge began, her voice steady. "You are here to address allegations of excessive force during an arrest. The evidence submitted includes body camera footage, witness statements, and the medical report of the individual involved. Do you understand the gravity of this matter?" Kane tilted his head slightly, his smirk resurfacing. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it seems like a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. I've reviewed the footage myself, and I believe I acted well within protocol." The gallery murmured softly, and Judge Fowler tapped her gavel once, silencing the room. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "This court will determine whether your actions were within protocol, Officer Kane. It's not your role to pass judgment here." Instead of backing down, Kane leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge. "And with respect, Your Honor, I know my job. Sometimes situations require quick thinking and a firm hand. People outside the field don't always understand that." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable, and the gallery exchanged glances, some whispering to one another. Judge Fowler's expression remained unreadable, but her grip on her gavel tightened ever so slightly. "Officer Kane," she said, her voice colder now, "this is not a debate. This is a legal proceeding, and I suggest you adjust your attitude accordingly. Your conduct today will weigh heavily on the court's perception of your credibility." For a moment, Kane hesitated, as if weighing whether to push further. Then, with an exaggerated shrug, he sat back in his chair, his smirk fading into a look of feigned indifference. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, though the sarcasm in his tone was undeniable. The judge turned her attention to the prosecutor, who began laying out the case in meticulous detail. The body camera footage was played for the court, showing Kane's interaction with the suspect, a young man accused of petty theft. The video revealed an unnecessary escalation, with Kane resorting to force almost immediately after the suspect failed to comply with his initial commands. As the footage ended, a hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Fowler's gaze shifted back to Kane, her expression stern. "Officer Kane, how do you explain your actions in this video?" Kane straightened in his chair, his confidence unwavering. "Your Honor, as I said before, sometimes you have to make quick decisions. That suspect was resisting, and I acted in the interest of public safety. If I hesitated, someone could have been hurt." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Someone could have been hurt? Or someone was hurt because of your actions?" Kane opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The gallery watched in anticipation, waiting for the judge's next move. But Kane wasn't ready to back down just yet. Judge Fowler leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Kane. The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing on everyone present. She let the pause stretch just long enough to let him, and everyone else, feel its significance. "Officer Kane," she said calmly, "what you've just described is a justification, not an explanation. There's a critical difference. This court is not here to evaluate your instincts, but to assess whether those instincts align with the law and your oath as an officer. Let me ask you again. How do you explain the injuries sustained by the suspect?" Kane's confidence faltered slightly. He glanced at his attorney, who gave him a subtle nod to proceed carefully. Clearing his throat, Kane replied, "The suspect resisted arrest. I used the necessary force to subdue him. It was a controlled situation." Judge Fowler's expression remained neutral, but there was a glimmer of sharp focus in her eyes. "Controlled? Let's examine that. The footage clearly shows that the suspect complied after your initial commands, but became defensive only when you escalated the situation. Why did you choose to escalate when compliance was already underway?" Kane stiffened, clearly unprepared for the pointed question. "Your Honor, I acted based on my training." "Your training?" Judge Fowler interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Your training teaches you to escalate force before confirming non-compliance? Or does it teach you to de-escalate in situations where the suspect poses no immediate threat?" The gallery watched intently, their eyes darting between the judge and the officer. Kane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was assessing the situation in real time. It's not always black and white." Judge Fowler leaned forward, her voice dropping to a tone that commanded absolute attention. "No, Officer Kane, it's not black and white. But the law is clear, and your badge does not give you the authority to blur those lines for convenience or arrogance." The room was so still that even a whisper would have felt deafening. Kane's smirk was gone now, replaced by a look of frustration he couldn't quite hide. His hands fidgeted slightly, a stark contrast to his earlier bravado. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Continue with the next piece of evidence." The prosecutor presented witness statements, one of which came from a bystander who had recorded the incident on their phone. The witness described the interaction as unnecessarily aggressive, noting that the suspect appeared cooperative before being forced to the ground. As the statement was read, Kane's face flushed, his earlier confidence now visibly cracking. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Kane shook his head, clearly unwilling to concede. He shifted in his chair, his body tense. Judge Fowler addressed him again. "Officer Kane, what you're facing here is more than an allegation. It's a question of integrity, of whether the power entrusted to you has been misused." Do you understand the responsibility that comes with wearing that badge? Kane hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he seemed to consider her words, but his pride still clung to him like armor. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. The judge's gaze didn't waver. I hope you do. Because the actions in that footage don't reflect an understanding of responsibility. They reflect a misunderstanding of power. But Kane wasn't ready to let go of his pride so easily, and the tension in the room continued to mount. The courtroom air grew heavier as Judge Fowler motioned for the prosecutor to continue. The next piece of evidence was the phone footage, recorded from a slightly different angle than the body camera. It painted an even clearer picture of the incident. The suspect, a wiry young man in his 20s, stood with his hands raised, his voice pleading as Kane grabbed him by the arm. The footage showed Kane's actions escalating swiftly, leading to the suspect being slammed against a patrol car. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the video concluded, and Judge Fowler's face hardened, though her voice remained steady. Officer Kane, I have reviewed both the body camera and this supplemental footage. What I see is not a controlled situation, but a clear instance of excessive force. Would you care to explain this from your perspective? Kane's confidence, once so unshakable, began to crumble. His hands tightened into fists as he spoke. Your Honor, situations like this are unpredictable. People lie, and suspects can act compliant one moment and lash out the next. I was protecting myself and others. Judge Fowler folded her hands on the bench, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Kane's growing agitation. Protecting yourself and others. The footage shows a suspect who posed no immediate threat. Did you fear for your life in that moment, Officer Kane? The room fell silent again. Kane hesitated, his face a mix of frustration and uncertainty. I wasn't going to take any chances. Not taking chances is not the same as ignoring protocols, Judge Fowler replied firmly. Your role as an officer demands discernment, not reactionary force. The badge you wear does not absolve you of accountability. Kane opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice from the gallery spoke up. He didn't have to do it. The guy was just scared. All eyes turned toward the speaker, a middle-aged woman seated in the back row. Her tone wasn't confrontational but filled with quiet conviction. I was there. I saw the whole thing. That young man wasn't fighting. He was begging him to stop. Kane's face turned beet red as murmurs swept through the room. His attorney rose swiftly. Your Honor, I request that the court disregard unsolicited comments from the gallery. Judge Fowler raised her gavel but didn't strike it. Instead, she looked at the woman. Ma'am, while I understand your frustration, this court must proceed in an orderly fashion. Please refrain from further comments. The woman nodded, her expression resolute but respectful. The judge turned back to Kane. Officer Kane, this testimony, combined with the footage, paints a troubling picture. I will give you one final opportunity to explain your actions before we proceed. Kane's jaw tightened, his bravado now fully replaced by a defensive edge. Your Honor, I did what I thought was right in the moment. Maybe I could have handled it differently, but I don't regret prioritizing safety. Judge Fowler let his words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Safety is indeed a priority, but not at the expense of fairness, protocol, or human dignity. Your actions suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of your role as a public servant. Kane's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. He glanced at his attorney, but the man offered no reprieve, his expression grim. But the lesson Judge Fowler was about to deliver would leave no room for excuses. Judge Fowler leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Officer Kane, being an officer of the law is a responsibility, not a privilege to wield authority unchecked. What I've seen here today is not just a lapse in judgment, but a failure to honor the very oath you swore to uphold. You claim to prioritize safety, yet your actions jeopardize trust, the cornerstone of any community relationship with law enforcement. Kane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier bravado had vanished entirely, leaving behind a young man visibly grappling with the consequences of his actions. The gallery watched with bated breath, the gravity of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The judge continued, her tone firm but steady. This court is not here to humiliate you, Officer Kane, nor is it here to ignore the complexities of your role. However, it is clear that your approach reflects a dangerous misunderstanding of power. The role of an officer is not to intimidate or control, but to protect and serve with fairness and integrity. Kane's head lowered slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of humility crossed his face. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Kane didn't react. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, and it was clear he was struggling to come to terms with it. Judge Fowler addressed the courtroom. Let this serve as a reminder to everyone here. Accountability does not equate to weakness, and authority without accountability becomes tyranny. We must all hold ourselves to the highest standards, regardless of the roles we play in society. The gallery sat in stunned silence, her words resonating deeply. It wasn't just a rebuke of Kane's actions, but a broader commentary on the responsibility that comes with power, something that applied to everyone in the room. Turning back to Kane, the judge's voice softened slightly. Officer Kane, I'm placing you on probation and ordering mandatory retraining in de-escalation techniques. Additionally, you will issue a formal apology to the individual involved in this case. This is not merely a punishment, it is an opportunity to reflect and grow. Do not waste it. Kane nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. The gavel struck once, signaling the end of the hearing. The courtroom began to stir, spectators exchanging quiet murmurs as they filed out. But the moment lingered, a potent mix of relief, reflection, and the unmistakable weight of a lesson learned. Judge Fowler remained seated, watching as Kane exited the courtroom. She could see the turmoil in his expression, the conflict between his pride and the realization of his misstep. She hoped the lesson would stick, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes, humility is the first step toward true strength. As the courtroom emptied, the story of that day stayed with everyone who had witnessed it. Officer Kane's arrogance, Judge Fowler's unwavering composure, and the undeniable power of accountability painted a vivid picture of how justice is more than laws and regulations. It's about respect, responsibility, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. For Kane, the lesson was clear. Authority isn't about domination, it's about service. In a single hearing, he'd been forced to confront his own ego and recognize the harm his actions had caused. And for the judge, it was a testament to the strength of leading with wisdom and grace, even in the face of blatant defiance. Stories like this remind us that everyone, whether in a position of power or not, has a choice. We can wield authority carelessly, or we can use it to build trust and promote fairness. The moments that define us often come when we're willing to learn, to grow, and to do better. If you've taken something meaningful away from this story, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Reflect on your own choices, the power of humility, and the impact of leading with integrity. And if you'd like to see more stories that challenge, inspire, and make you think, make sure to subscribe and join the conversation. Justice isn't just about the decisions made in a courtroom, it's about the actions we take every day.